speaker, but it's kind of nice to end on this note to bring a former Purdue student back from the wilds of the professional world to close out the semester. We will have, of course, lectures next semester. We have an ABD student in philosophy and literature starting us off. Eric Ham is going to give a lecture. We tried this once with Sophia Stone, and her lecture went really well, we think, so we're going to continue with that and have students who are finishing their dissertation who are ABD an opportunity to present some of their work. So Eric will start us off. We'll have Tom Sparrow here from Slippery Rock University. His book, The End of Phenomenology, just came out, and he's working right now. I think his talk will be on Dewey and plasticity. I've met Tom at a conference in Pittsburgh, and he's a really, really great guy. We'll also have, I want to make sure I say her last name right, Gina Zavoda from Kent State University. She works on Deleuze and ancient philosophy, so we expect to hear something about Deleuze and Empedocles from her. And hopefully we'll have also our very own Daniel Kelly to give us a lecture, most likely on David Foster Wallace, so that would be interesting. So that's next semester. That's what we got in store. But for now, I'd like to introduce Robert King. He is an associate professor in the Department of Humanities at Sierra Nevada College in Nevada, and a research fellow at the Centre Léo Pastel at the Free University of Brussels. Last year, Robert was a visiting fellow at Duke University's Center for the History of Political Economy, and as a graduate of the Philosophy and Literature program, his doctoral dissertation, System, Individuation, in Differential and Dialectical Ontology, Deleuze, Hegel, and Systematic Thought, received the 2011 College of Liberal Arts Distinguished Dissertation Award. Robert publishes in the fields of systems theory, philosophy, and political economy, and has studied at the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell University, at the Collegium Phenomenologicum, with the Unseld Lecture Series at the University of Tübingen. He has been a visiting fellow of the World Congress Summer School in Glasgow, Scotland, with the Association for Social Economics, a visiting scholar under the National Endowment for the Humanities 2012 Summer Institutes, a fellow at the National Humanities Center's Franklin Research Grant, which he used to study the Norbert Wiener papers at MIT, John F. Kennedy School for North American Studies. He is an inaugural member of the London Graduate School Summer Academy in Critical Humanities, and this last summer he was a text seminar leader on Hegel's logic under Angelica Nuzzo at the Collegium Phenomenologicum. He is also the book review editor for Constructivist Foundations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert.
Thank you. I do want to start off with thanking all of you for showing up here and coming to hear this paper. The fact that you can get a decent audience to come out and hear, one person's kind of philosophy paper is probably a mark of a well-organized department. So, especially to the organizers of the department and this series in particular, I want to extend the thanks. I mean, a genuine one. So I hope that you will forgive me a kind of sloppy preamble, which will allow me to contextualize and set up the aims of this lecture. Significant parts of this paper will draw from the recent work of Robert Beale, and particularly his Entropy of Capitalism book and his work in that field, thinking about the systemic limits of capitalism and also as that, and how that relates to the problem of imperialism and corporate dynamics and a set of related themes. So I'm going to get into this now. But Beale says that radicals often speak of the system to signify the socio-economic entity which currently oppresses us. The term implies that something has built up a momentum of its own, he continues, right, and becomes a self-propagating force, severed from rational control and consuming the society which produced it, end of quote. So not just economic exploitation, militarism, ideological alienation, etc., right? Indeed, the idea is that no set of particular properties or some of said properties therein actually constitutes, right, this oppressing system proper. The term, as used by the radicals Beale characterizes, or perhaps caricatures, implies rather that some unqualifiable thing has built up a momentum of its own and become a self-propagating force, severed from rational control, and consuming the society which produced it. He states, the premise of this book, referring to the entropy of capitalism, is that this intuition that radicals have about the system is exactly on the right lines, but will only reveal its true potential if we really push the systems notion to a point where we can be rigorous about its implications. My lecture begins from this same aspiration. I want to suggest that examination of systems concepts can offer decent purchase on a set of related questions. One, an ontological one. What is the system that those who speak of the system speak of when trying to come to terms with the failure of their politics to steer the system toward desired ends? I'll address this ontological question just briefly. Here, the form of my question is the following. Does the system Beale here invokes, in fact, the capital system, actually constitute a system? How so, and in what sense? Two, the ontological question is wrapped up immediately in epistemic questions about valid ways of knowing whether it is possible to assign certain types of useful systemic properties like wholeness or kind of minimal coherency, quantifiability, predictability, agency, etc., to systems which are hyper-complex, such as social systems, such as the capital system. And who says what constitutes capital as such, especially in its systemic and epistemic dimensions? So allow me a short discursus here. Of course, there have always been voices in the crowd that excoriate the very notion of system precisely because the term has no precise referent or some such kind of argument. So that the trouble is magnified when we add to it the term capital. Maurice Daub, in his well-known 1947 monograph, Studies in the Development of Capitalism, put the point this way. It is perhaps not altogether surprising that the term capitalism, which in recent years, yeah, it was written in 1947, but has enjoyed so wide a currency alike in popular talk and in historical writing, should have been used so variously, and that there should have been no common measure of agreement in its use. What is more remarkable is that in economic theory, as this has been expounded by the traditional schools, the term should have appeared so rarely, if at all. Daub also indicates the problem the concept of capital, or capitalism, then faces. He says, Sombart, in his article on the subject in the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, says, this term is not found in Gide, Cause, Marshall, Seligman, or Cassel, to mention only the best-known texts. And in other treatises, such as those of Schindler, Adolf Wagner, Richard Ehrenberg, and Filipovich, there is some discussion of capitalism, but the concept of capitalism is subsequently rejected. Neither Palgrave's Dictionary of Political Economy nor the Dictionnaire de l'économie politique includes the term capitalism, written at this time in 1947. Now, when we consult the dictionaries of political economy today, do we find a well-defined term? When we come to consider capital or capitalism as a concept today, can we say that its situation is much changed from the one Daub recognized in 1947? Does capitalism describe a concept with a distinct extension? Does it possess a referent, offer itself up to reliable intuitions, mark a distinct object, satisfy criterion affirming its status as the object of a representation, etc., etc.? What is capitalism such that it forms a system? Admittedly, Daub recognizes that the problem may not lie with capitalism, but with its status as a system. There is even a school of thought, he says, numbering its adherents among both economists and historians, which has refused to recognize that capitalism as a title for a determinate economic system can be given an exact meaning. But is the problem for Daub one pertaining to its status as a system, or is the problem of a more general or methodological nature, say with economics or with historiography? Unclear in that text. Daub notes another problem. No period of history, it is said, is ever made of whole cloth. Since all periods are complex admixtures of elements, it is a misleading simplification to label any section of the historical process with the title of a single element. One ought to pause and consider, though, upon what basis it is that Daub speaks in the first place of distinct historical periods, processes, or elements, right? If the term capital is so undecidable, what gives validity to his distinguishing between something like a period in the first place, right? And again, this is not the sort of tract in which he actually would go into that question, but still I think it's an important point to raise. 4, do not these terms encounter the same issues of identification, isolation, and labeling? Dobb is clear, however, that a system like capitalism may be spoken of abstractly as describing an aspect which in varying measure has characterized numerous periods of history, but as such it is an abstract economic notion, not an historical one, and to trace back the origins of any such system, in scare quotes here, is generally a vain pursuit that can have no end. If capitalism does not exist as an historical entity, critics of the present economic order who call for a change of system are tilting at windmills. And Marx, in particular, who was originally responsible for the talk about a capitalist system, was following a will o' the wisp. End quote. Yet on this formulation, the problem seems to lie ever more clearly not with the system term, but with the referent capital. It is as if the referent simply does not constitute a system, despite the fact that we find the term system and not capitalism placed in scare quotes in Dobbs' passage. And so we ought to attend to all the reservations those Marx suggests. Not for now, though. Slavoj Žižek, in an entirely different context, puts the problem thusly. But if today capitalism has received authoritative recognition as an historical category, this affords no assurance that those who claim to study this system are talking about the same thing. Some might think that a variety of usage gave little ground for comment and could do no great harm. But the difference of verbal usage is not only associated with a different emphasis in the search for what is relevant among the multitude of historical incidents, and with a different principle of selection in composing the chronicle of events, but is apt to lead to a different mode of interpretation, and a different causal genetic story. Though this, too, will not be the subject of my lecture today, I'll take a nod from Zizek's understanding of Hegel and look at the capital system as a causal, or rather structural, genetic, or better even developmental, if we're going to stick close to the Hegelian kind of language here, a developmental category, rather than as a traditional concept. I'll also take a nod from Ferdinand Braudel, who wrote, "If capitalism is thrown out of the door, it comes in through the window. For whether one likes it or not, there was, even in the pre-industrial era, a form of economic activity irresistibly evocative of this word and of no other. While such activity may not yet have been employing the industrial mode of production, which I do not consider myself to be the be-all and end-all of capitalism, it cannot, in any case, be confused with classic market transactions." End of Braudel. So I'll propose a notion of the capital system and put some concepts to work to try and outline what I take its behavior and future course to be. But back to Dobb, who might have considered that Marx did not trace history per se out. Marx's historiography is rather more structural than narratival. Does not seek out origins or beginnings in time. And here I mean the Marx in particular, who is trying to sort of establish the parameters of the capital system. The point for Zizek, as it is for us, is that capitalism, considered as a system, cannot be grasped through a historical narrative left alone. The more useful device is the one that one which we believe Marx ought to take much of the credit for, but which we don't find represented until perhaps post-Marxist and structural variants on his idea of system, and Althusser is noteworthy here. What I'll call attention to in the Marxist, post-Marxian understanding of system is a structural notion of the system. So my excursus is over now. That wasn't really too brief after all. But. So more on these last points about structure below. First, I'd like to mention a third question that I see attending to what I referred to above as the decent purchase that systems concepts can give us on grasping the nature of the system, the capital system, which Beale identifies again as that system which has built up a momentum of its own and become a self-propagating force. This third question is the question of agency. Who or what drives the self-propagating force, right, of the capital system, if it has a self-propagating force? Following a certain Marxist strain of thinking, I'm tempted right off the bat to say that it is structure, or a certain dynamic notion of structure, that does the driving, but this answer is immediately unsatisfying, as it fails to provide an answer to the question, where does structure come from? In discussing the inversion of the classical Aristotelian ideal type paradigm and biological evolutionary thinking, Manuel de Landa offers an instructive example on this point. He notes, "It becomes clear that there was no such thing as a pre-existing collection of traits defining zebrahood. Each of the particular adaptive traits which we observe in real zebras developed along different ancestral lineages, accumulated in the population under the action of different selection pressures, in a process that was completely dependent on specific and contingent historical details. In other words, just as these traits, and this is still him, just as these traits, camouflage, running speed, and so on, happened to come together in zebras, they might not have, had the actual history of those populations been different. This seems like an insightful point, but where did the traits or structures of camouflage, running speed, and so on come from in the first place? Certainly these structures themselves are subject to the same histories of contingency. Camouflage does not come ready-made. It is not the positing of structure, is not the positing of structure, a sort of presumption that a priori does all the heavy explanatory lifting. We have an infinite regress of looking for causes of structure, or we establish a well-nigh axiomatic starting point, naming it positing structure, neither of which are entirely satisfying. If one reduces these structures to chance outcomes of zebra populations' genetic variability, one has still posited zebra populations, another version of zebrahood, now under a different name at the get-go. But the idea is that if enough variant traits arise spontaneously, then the sorting process of natural selection can bring together those features which today define it as a zebra. For population thinkers, only variation is real, and the ideal type is a mere shadow. Still, variation is strictly unthinkable without some form of consistency. Here again, one must posit the presupposition. One must isolate some set of structural traits or arrangements and see what sort of behaviors follow from seeing these traits intersect dynamically. I identify this kind of an activity with the Marxist approach to analyzing capital, and it certainly has strong Hegelian affinities. Meanwhile, some minimally agential forces must be posited and must be shown to actually drive the system if we wish to say that the system has built up a momentum of its own. What I'd like to draw attention to here is the fact that more orthodox humanist, dialectical, and more orthodox structuralist varieties of Marxism and systems theory have perhaps been displaced in recent continental philosophy and theory by outright alien posits of agency. We now live in and dissect the system in a space of agential posits that seem to be becoming more and more real, and these non-human kind of agential posits that are becoming more and more real, right? Regard certain versions of Deleuzo-Guattarian desiring machines, Luhmann's autopoietic social systems, Ian Bogost's alien entities, Frege Negarestani's notion of the inhuman, Nick Land's teleoplexy, two object-oriented ontologies that might imagine the human as rather like a virus of the system of capital rather than anything like its, in any meaningful sense, true driving force. Naturally, such questions of agency complicate the first two questions mentioned above, the ontological and epistemological questions, but to return to Beale's self-propagating force severed from rational control and consuming the society which produced it, we ought to ask, what is this self which propagates? What if this rational control is precisely inhuman or alien? How then do we gain insights on such a system? So to sum up, when I say that systems concepts can provide decent purchase on questions relating to this thing which has built up a momentum of its own and become a self-propagating force, severed from rational control and consuming a society which has produced it, I mean to say that system concepts precisely allow us to navigate this difficult terrain. They provide a general framework which enables us to deal with all manner of entities, to eschew any too rigidifying humanism, and perhaps mainly the correlationist Kantian transcendental framework where form is given in advance, such that any viable heterogeneity or externality from the world of matter itself, the rich world of material thermo-entropic flows, is subdued or domesticated under the categories of a human mind. So that was my preamble, and here's an introduction. But the introduction is pretty much the rest of the papers. So there's a lot on the table here. And I won't address nearly all of what I've laid out in this preamble, but I hope I've established a decent outline of the foundational philosophical problems that I'll be speaking to, or rather even around tonight. So to restate a few things for clarity. The system concepts I use to find a certain framework of analysis, a framework which is probably not good at answering to the first ontological questions I posed. What is a system? What is capital? System concepts are best when they presuppose some operative systematicity already there in advance and posit a distinction between system, the internal homogeneous structure with some set of heterogeneous forces which perturb, reorganize, or obliterate internal structure. Here, system concepts get off the ground by asking, how is it that a system's structure, which must first be positive, even if this structure changes during the life of the system, how is it that a system structure metabolizes or is triggered by that which is external to it, those flows or fluxes that its structure constantly possesses or processes as information or noise. Tonight's lecture will then bypass its first ontological question. I will not ask what is capital a system, but will assume as much, following in the wake of a certain Marxist systems theoretical tradition which makes the same distinction. I will resolve all epistemic questions in a similar fashion. I will not seek to ask how humans have access to system dynamics, but will treat the system dynamics I analyze as epistemically valid starting points and then lay out those dynamics in a manner congruent with current systems theoretical discourses. In particular, I will follow Beale in adopting the dissipative systems theoretical starting point. That is, I will treat thermodynamics and information as key terms in the operations of capital and in the entropy it encounters and produces. Information applies to internal structure, the extent to which a system makes sense and functions coherently. Thermodynamics addresses the energy flows or fluxes. I can't get into that distinction, and thus the evolutionary capabilities of the system. Versus equilibrium thermodynamics, then, dealing with systems that are close to their environments and by necessity postulating that stability can only be reached when all useful energy has been transformed into heat. The thermodynamics I address will be of a dissipative order. Here, the full potential of the concept of environment comes to the fore. That is, when systems are open to their environments, they are subject to constant influxes of flows of matter, energy, and information from the outside. Not to be forgotten, too, is that these flows must also exit the system in question. The waste products need to be dissipated into some surrounding system, with all the consequences that entails for systems. Thus, I will take it as basic that there must be an exchange of energy with an environment or surrounding system if we are to maintain or seek to improve society's internal coherence. Otherwise, as a closed system, we would be condemned to degenerate in the direction of greater entropy. Beale points out, quote, we can represent this entropy either as disorder or as complementary formulation, as a descent into the wrong kind of orderedness. Uniformity, a homogenized system which has lost the rich variety of signs, is in no position to carry information. As for the third question I addressed in the preamble, that of agency, I take it to be basic that there's a lot of it going on. Thermodynamic laws, entropy and information, material and emergent system properties, human and alien or ecological agents, all play a role in the torsions the capital system is currently undergoing and in the effects it has on human systems and human attempts to steer the system in a certain way. The task of a system's critique of capitalism could doubtlessly have been posed at any point of its history, but has special significance today, entering as we do a crisis of a new type where two systems, human and ecological, come into conflict, and capitalism now consumes not just society itself, but its physical environment, to a point where neither human or ecological systems can regenerate. I do think the system of capital has strong agential power in lacing together this conflict, and yet I do not think that these systems are fated to a runaway bad dynamic, except perhaps unless they remain under the subsumption of capital. But they are sustainable, human and ecological systems, on meaningful terms. So the sense in which we define meaningful here would have to be the product of a decision about what to sustain. Beale argues that if there is a threat to human and ecological sustainability, it comes from the agency of the capital system. Its structural dynamics generate ecologically destructive behaviors, which undermine the possibility of human agency. Yet, Beale does not address points of the following type. Just what we have lived as human agency in the Anthropocene, for example, is contingently but really constructed by a capital system which has entered into the human's environment. No less, we might say, have humans entered into or interpenetrated the capital system's environment. So questions of agency are tough. Perhaps it is just machines everywhere. Yet, which machines do we wish to see sustained? Who is we? After all, we doesn't come for free. So all these questions of agency are terribly complicated. But putting to the side this question for now, I do believe, along with Beale, that we can pursue a normative commitment to bettering the human condition because we are lucky to have an environment in the first place. But obviously nothing in the mere fact of having an environment would necessitate this normative commitment. Again, decisions would have to be made. But the making of decisions does depend on the existence of a certain sustainable environment in which something like a space of decisions or decision-making can occur. It seems clear that the system of capital, now in a space where it consumes itself, is an agent in which such decision-making cannot, in fact, occur for much longer. The ecological limits of this possibility are at stake as human agents confront eco-catastrophe, largely attributable, on my understanding and on my interpretation, to capital's deep structural dynamics. If we exhaust either the energy source or the environment's capacity to absorb disorder, heat, waste, the entropy will return to haunt us. Today, with peak oil and climate change, both kinds of revenge impinge together and interact. The green movement recognizes such external limits, but what must be emphasized is the drive from within pushing against them. This is where Marxism is essential. Our strategic goal of eventually stabilizing humanity's relation with its environment must never be confused with stabilizing the capitalist mode of production. Were we sidetracked into attempting the latter, which is impossible anyway, we would disastrously amplify the causes of the problem. Only Marxism posits this distinction clearly. We get a deeper glimpse of the use of Marxism that I wish to draw our attention to here. We still have yet to return to notions of entropy and the drive which pushes against the external limits of a system that is characteristic of a certain problem of the green movement. So what distinction is being referred to here exactly, which Marxism posits directly, right? Well, what must be granted now is some definite notion of capital structure or internal coherence, because it is only from this vantage that, taken as an entity, the capital system might dissipate entropy into its surrounding systems or have a self-propagating force at all. Or that we might speak of a non-capitalist system, right? It's only if we can make that distinction right, in the first place. Capitalism, non-capitalism kind of distinction. Assigning some structure to capital is first necessary if we wish to distinguish between capital's mode of production and the environment as such. It's another thing, right? That a distinction between capital and some kind of non-capitalist mode of production or regime of accumulation would have to satisfy the requirements for the answer to that. So Beale himself, in The Entropy of Capitalism, does not do a stellar job of outlining just what he takes capitalism to be, often characterizing it in terms of its internal contradictions, a concept that's tough enough to kind of get at. But one of these might be, for example, this is something Beale likes to talk about, contradiction evident in the fact that the mechanisms which generate wealth in our system are exactly the same mechanisms that generate poverty. But what structures are there within this system that dynamically interact to produce contradictions, right? And this is why I prefer to turn to a certain Marxist structuralist take on the system of capital. In particular, I think the work of Istvan Mészáros is especially illuminating in defining the structural agency of capital, though one cannot forget Althusser's seminal work on the question of a kind of human agent-less structure within the system of capital. I'm not going to address that, though. So, are the realities today, from food shortages in the periphery to structural forms of violence, not systemically related? Why is there poverty and hunger alongside the rise of global temperatures while polarized caps melt at unprecedented rates? Why are there, at the same time, violent revolutions throughout the Middle East and unidirectional tendencies toward increased militarization? Surely, today's crises are not isolated or random, but flow out in patterned forms from the deepest structures of our society, and yet it is difficult to say that these patterns and structures are definitively human in their origin, much less in their dynamic organizations and tendencies. Such realities, crises really, may be conceived on the rationale for the capitalist political economy upon which the society is based. From the system's point of view, the current international political economy is a precise result of the conditions by which structured forms of energy, materials, and information flow through and are reproduced in our social system with its overarching logic of capital. It is Marx who ought to be credited with the invention of posing this set of interlocking problems where crisis meets with ecology under the form of precise types of political, economic, but definitely systemic social organization. Concepts of social metabolic rift or social metabolic reproduction were developed early on in his economic and philosophical manuscripts, for example, and also used in Das Kapital, including in some more empirical studies from volume 3 of that text. There's also a good bit of scholarship on this concept today, this range of concepts, social metabolic reproduction, social metabolic rift. I'll stick with the former over the latter. For instance, John Bellamy Foster of Monthly Review and a younger scholar, Jason Moore, are here representative, though much of the pioneering work on this concept of social metabolic reproduction, again, I think can be traced to Istvan Mitsaros. But he's certainly Marxist in his reading. He never tries to depart from Marx in an interesting way. So even Mitsaros wants to credit Marx very fully with this concept of the social metabolic reproduction. And this concept, my reading of this concept will be important for me defining how I see the capital's structure actually playing out, so that we can talk about its effects as a system. Basically, social metabolic reproduction refers to the ways in which societies take certain material inputs and transform them into socially useful, hopefully useful, outputs. Ultimately, the reproduction of the society itself would be the key output. Though this system's theoretical language is not Marx's, the concept of inputs and outputs helps grasp the metabolism associated with the term. Input-output refers to structure, but also to metabolic process. For instance, in the way in which one might eat an apple, taken as an input, in order to derive caloric nutrition as an output to reconstitute the body. Stated more formally, social metabolic reproduction refers to the processes through which societies direct inputs and outputs of energy, matter, and information toward the maintenance of the structurally necessary components required for their continual reproduction. The concept helps to grasp structural cycles of growth, collapse, and social regeneration. Applications of the concept also help to identify the structural crises that affect social systems. Social systems must continuously reproduce core structural components over time, I want to take that as basic, in order to maintain their integrity as systems against perturbations from their environment. If the core structures of any system are not reproduced, then the system will undergo determinate crises. For example, the feudal seigneurial system depended on certain inputs, for example, an agricultural surplus product, distributed in a certain proportion between lord and vassal, precise obligations, services, and bonds of fidelity between the social classes. It's a bit of a caricature of the feudal world, I know, but I'm just laying out some deep structures there. Ultimately, when these structural components could no longer be reproduced, the feudal system collapsed. On systems terms, one might say that the feudal system, a regime of attraction of structurally necessary inputs and outputs in its own right, underwent a bifurcating phase change, opening the space for the system of capital to emerge. Thus, the driving idea behind social metabolic reproduction is that the dynamic historical structure of a society can be understood by looking at the way it directs inputs and outputs in the service of reproducing its structurally necessary components necessary for its reproduction. In order to grasp something like the systematicity of the system of capital, we would do well to examine its key inputs and outputs and their transformations in reproducing and conserving that deeper structure of capital, and we would be hard-pressed to argue that these key input-output structures are in any way human, even if these structures draw humans into their orbit, or even if humans are foundational for the development of that system. Once it emerges, it no longer matters. They especially seem to lose that human quality in their functioning. One thinks here of the runaway dynamics of positive feedback processes that occur, say, with the way in which even early agricultural societies experienced population explosions once they began to generate food surpluses. At a certain stage in the game of such dynamics, human agency drops out of the picture, to a large extent at least. At a certain stage, just as no individual human generates a population explosion, certainly no summing up of individual humans in their totality takes us any closer to pinning down such positive feedback processes, pinning them down to human agential structure, leastwise in any intentional or goal-directed sense. So back to capital structure. With respect to its social metabolic reproduction, the capital system must constantly convert the bulk of its energy, materials, and information into the continual reproduction of the following structurally necessary components. And here they are. A structurally enforced inequality between capital and labor, a constant accumulation of capital as a kind of rule or code, with an ever-expanding profit motive, a private property system with private ownership of the means of production, or the accumulation of dead labor into living capital, an in principle uncontrollable global market with fetishistic production objectives, a nation-state system as a framework of international relations where each state confronts each other, sometimes violently, over the control of inputs and outputs, over the capture and control of fluxes of capital, such that nation-states begin to look more like entities that are designed precisely to capture and control flows of capital, though I don't think that should be a shocking conception of the nation-state anymore, especially expressed so generically here. But perhaps as well we might think of structures like a nuclear family, which socializes individuals to ensure the legitimization of the minimal status quo objectives of the state, and the regulation of biological reproduction, just to name a few, albeit crucial, structures. Again, if a significant portion of these structurally necessary components of the system of capital are threatened or displaced, the system demonstrates signs of crises, and the integrity of the system is open to collapse. This framework allows one to grasp crisis phenomena in terms of the system's reproductive strategies. Indeed, one of the main focuses of research in analyzing social metabolic reproduction is to identify the systemic bases of what appear to be a diverse set of structural crises and to try to examine the causal links between these crises and the system that generates them. For instance, one might use the concept of social metabolic reproduction to trace out and examine the following crises common to the system of capital, which appear a slight bit more like epiphenomena compared to these deeper structures I'm outlining below, but that's a very debatable point. In any case, I'll outline these kinds of crises, which I think those structures, right, that I said, kind of at the core of the system's reproduction generate. Cyclical problems with overaccumulation and underproduction, boom and bust cycles. The appropriation of labor by capital, or the separation of the majority of the population from access to the inputs defining the means of subsistence, and so the inequitable structure of the ownership of means of production and the productive resources and technologies used to extract surplus labor. Dependency on material resources, high input dependency in particular, hydrocarbon inputs, for example, for surplus production, both industrial and financial. A monetary system and reserve banking, fiat money, financialization of the economy as a process brought about by adherence to the social metabolic reproduction of capital. The politics of nation states and national identities, various international relations frameworks as problems of political representation, again in relation to the capital system and social metabolic reproduction. The problem of poverty vis-a-vis global governance institutions like the IMF and World Bank as control structures within the capital system's economy, and its transition from control of agricultural surplus through tariffs and trade organizations to a more general financialization of the economy, for example, false securitization of mortgages and loans and so forth. And finally, the philosophical and ontological presuppositions that underlie the various ideologies of the system of capital and its value system understood systemically. Again, each of these crises must be understood not as isolated problems, but systemically in terms of the system's overarching social metabolic reproductive strategies. Specifying the structural makeup of the system of capital, then, as well as the relations that this system maintains with other pertinent systems, like ecological systems, systems of human labor, which now these systems seem definitively to me to be in the environment of the system of capital, provides insights into the management or governance of current crises. The system of capital generates the structural crises defining our world in virtue of its structure and the necessity it has, as with all systems, to dissipate or funnel entropy, a variety of waste products and unusable forms of energy, into its environment, since it must engage in such forms of dissipation just in order to reproduce itself, again, as with all systems. The process is not dissimilar to the ways in which biological organisms must take in food and also expel harmful waste products just in order to be. At the level of the international political economy, it is not a stretch to see how such entropy production by the core wealthiest enclaves of society in the capital system is used to debilitate the periphery, the global south in particular, upon which it has historically depended for the cheapest inputs of labor or abundant inputs of natural resources. For instance, the dumping of old cell phone computer technology waste into vast garbage heaps in many West African and Asian countries. The US threw out just shy of 3 million tons of household electronics in 2006 alone. So when Beale defines capital through the lens of entropy laws of thermodynamics with its entropy and entropy production, he's looking precisely at entropy-inducing and imperialist, to a degree, phenomena like this one. His account needs to be buttressed by a stronger sense of just what capital is. And for me, it's a more or less variant set of structures, as mentioned above, their requirements upon input-output conversion. But his account of the way in which capital accumulates and dissipates entropy is unparalleled in the system's literature on the subject. While all systems require inputs of energy to function and to produce outputs which will enable them to produce and reproduce their core structure, it is no less true that the entropic waste of such structural reproduction must be dissipated back into some external environment. On this framework, we can speak of crises when the environments a system draws from become depleted. Historically, the capital system has drawn its energy from two main sources, from labor, especially in the global south, and from natural environments, like rainforests, from which capital has extracted timber for construction projects, for example. Considering the astonishing depth of today's environmental crisis itself, in its current regime of accumulation at least, since its reliance on natural environments has become threatened. By regime of accumulation, I mean the manner or course in which at the most basic level, inputs are directed into the output of the sorts of structures that would have to be in place to adequately dissipate entropy safely into an environment. Thus, problems with abused environments become problems within the system, can steer its evolution. And this is compounded by the fact that capital's other essential inputs, source of inputs, labor, is only getting hungrier, one might say. As the system confronts such crises, it breaks down and is flooded with entropy, energy that it can no longer convert into useful structures required for its maintenance and functioning. Thus, the behavior of the capital system and its future evolutionary possibilities revolve around an accumulation regime, its manner of dissipating entropy, such that the behavior of the system is, from the get-go, in a certain sense, imperialist. Halford Mackinder was one of the first to see this aspect of the system's imperialism, though he lacked a systems theoretical vocabulary to express it. He wrote, "Every explosion of social forces, instead of being dissipated in a surrounding circuit of unknown space and surrounding chaos, will be sharply re-echoed from the far side of the globe, and weak elements in the political and economic organism of the world will be shattered in consequence." End quote. Mackinder had even called for a shift in the way we thought about imperialism, from a model based on territorial expansion to one based on the struggle for relative efficiency. Ultimately, this was a question of thermoentropic management of accumulation, but it seems essential to point out that by imperialism in this framework, what must be referred to are forms of entropy dumping, as when the core dumps waste into the periphery. Beale writes, "Therefore, we can say that the circuits or flows of entropy, exergy is free energy in the system that's available for use, right? So the opposite of entropy. They become a kind of artery for the entropy of capitalism, these flows of entropy and exergy. They are both the expression of the social contradictions which were transmuted, not eliminated, through transposition into an energy form, and a medium through which value gives the illusory impression of self-expansion through the sole operation of capital. Accumulation as a whole has thus become codependent with transformation and depletion, and cannot exist separately from it. The form of capital itself has adapted to this relationship, which we'll at times call cannibalistic or parasitic. I think those metaphors actually work here. Echoing Mackinder here, this statement of the problem also introduces the notion of the system's evolution and the importance of path-dependency to this process. Common sense blog reviewer Luigi Russi, which I don't know as a scholar necessarily, and I'm only quoting from a blog because this is one of the first pieces of literature that actually came out on this book, Entropy of Capitalism. Not that quoting from blogs is necessarily a bad thing, but in any case. Luigi Russi putting, in his review of Entropy of Capitalism, put this point about path dependency in the following way. Entropy, however, also refers to the ability to process information. In other words, as the system loses its ability to process diverse information and transform itself accordingly, it becomes responsive to only a narrow set of conditions and produces an even narrower set of responses that increase its fragility. So, for example, this is still the review I'm going from. Beale looks at the progressive inability of the system of capitalism to process information that contradicts its basic core periphery dynamics and becomes caught in a spiral of financial instability and militarization. This occurs because, on the one hand, finance, by reaping profits from risk, offers distorted feedback by promoting the multiplication of risk through speculation, thereby muffling the stabilizing feedback about the unsustainability of capitalist accumulation, which requires constant dissipation into an environment which effectively becomes a periphery. Militarization, on the other hand, is the response of late capitalist regimes to the increase in feedback, which the system is unable to process, and which is therefore bagged as chaos and subject to militaristic repression. We have a kind of circuit of finance with its speculative risk and militarization to attempt to control that. Meanwhile, risk itself creates a kind of sort of chaos and so forth. So a mutual kind of positive feedback loop. The way in which you would maybe deal with funding the military to control chaos itself would be a process that's based on speculation and risk in turn. Because who knows where to invest the right capital for the right kind of military weapons and operations and so forth. Historically, the political economy of the system of capital, this is now me, has deployed a series of regimes of accumulation in order to sustain its reproductive imperatives. Mercantilist, industrialist, Fordist, corporate multinational, firm-oriented, neoliberal, financier, and rentier-oriented economy, rentier-oriented versions of accumulation regimes. While the very logic of these regimes generates particular types of path dependency. Many people today think that we're in a neoliberal type style path dependency, although I think that the way in which that's now intersecting with new forms of finance, speculative capital, and so forth, signals a kind of end to at least the earlier, sort of early 70s versions of neoliberalism, although it's been being carried out now, so, of course. So it's a tough call. Food production is a good example here of another form of path dependency. When it comes to providing solutions to problems in food production, the main strategy of the post-Fordist neoliberal accumulation regime within the capital system has been to reverse or offset diminishing returns in food production by increasing the use of highly entropic methods associated with industrial and factory farming, even while such methods are the causes of these diminishing returns of food. The problem is one about positive feedback, wherein the presence of an element in a system causes an increase of that element. On this logic, for instance, toxins from chemicals used to increase agricultural output can only be reduced by the use of even more chemicals. Or take the situation in which today's counterterrorism measures are increasing terrorist activities. As a system is drying up, the ability to process information is turning into a sense that complexity has become too much to manage, such that counterterrorism becomes a frantic striving to outlaw complexity, which is unfortunately the very source where we get good information too. Michel Berenger has noted that when complexity grows into chaos, you have to admit defeat in seeking to comprehend it. You then draw a line around the region of chaos. You bag the mess. Berenger's metaphor suggests a dynamic similar to what we mean by path dependency in the way in which accumulation regimes are precisely structured by the way in which they are able to govern their complexity in light of this path dependency. Thus, accumulation regimes become modes of governance, and what is governed is the relationship between the attempt to conserve some particular structural motif associated with the regulation of input-output production in the face of dissipating entropy, the very condition upon which an accumulation regime is constructed in the first place. Yet in systems theory, despite the sound of Berenger's metaphor, chaos is not really or not necessarily a bad thing. It basically refers to nonlinear development or the possibility for bifurcation. It is therefore creative, particularly in the transitions between the periods of structural, social, metabolic order. But returning to the problem of imperialism within the system of capital in particular, what's special is that the capital system needs to revolutionize itself so often. Deleuze and Guattari were really good on this point in Anti-Oedipus, right? So capital actually works with chaos to ensure its governance over accumulation regimes, never allowing a break to a non-capitalist regime if possible. The system of capital has become so dangerously entropic, as it were, precisely because it monopolizes for itself the creative aspects of chaos while, and this is an important point, while the destructive aspects of chaos are dissipated or exported into the periphery. What it gains internally on the good side of complexity or information is a regime of relative stability in the shape of a new regime, but what is lost is the kind of long-term predictability or reliability of the system globally, and thus ecologically, over the long term in particular. What ramifies this danger, particular to the capital system and its need to constantly revolutionize itself through Schubertian creative destruction or Deleuzo-Guattarian generalization of flow decoding, is that today, capital's dominant accumulation regime responds to fully systemic and ecological crisis. The periphery, in which the core capitalist enclaves had once dissipated their entropy, they're no longer there. That's the real problem that I think capital is suffering today in its evolution, right? The current accumulation regime is trying its best to consistently take inputs and reduce those and to transform those into outputs that it can use for the reproduction of its structural order, but it has less and less of a periphery to draw from. So the chaos and entropy is increasing all around it. And now, I mean, there's less of a kind of pool or set of sinks to really draw that energy from or to dissipate it back into. So, again, metaphors of cannibalism, parasitism, system destruction seem very relevant and pertinent. So these capitalist core enclaves used to have a fuller sink to dissipate their entropy into. The periphery was much more expansive say in the 1800s, 1900s. But now the periphery, right, these regions, they've been sapped of exergy, free energy in the system available as viable inputs for the social metabolic reproduction. Put crudely, capital has sapped its periphery, and so now is evolving in relation to its own sort of cannibalism. It is parasitizing upon its own destruction. Author-activist Arundhati Roy presents a startling image of this very case. She wrote, "We, India, have a growing middle class, reared on a diet of radical consumerism and aggressive greed. Unlike industrializing Western countries, which had colonies from which to plunder resources and to generate slave labor to feed this process, we have to colonize ourselves, our own nether parts. We've begun to eat our own limbs. The greed that is being generated and marketed as value interchangeable with nationalism, which again is part of the structure of capital, so it's part of the capitalist project, can only be sated by grabbing land, water, and resources from the vulnerable, the most vulnerable. That's neoliberalism to a T almost. Right? This is an image of the capitalist neoliberal order itself, but make no mistake, the system of capital no longer has the sort of periphery through which it can continue to sap inputs for the reproduction of its structural order. The periphery is already eating away at its own limbs. Thus today, the capital system is linked to the problem of system-wide ecological crisis governance and appears to be defined by a condition in which three rival attractors set the stage for analysis of the system's future behavior. The system could end up in at least one of these attractors stabilizing a new accumulation regime. One, top-down management of emergent order, which is ineliminable until absolute destruction of any system. But top-down management of emergent order, number one, accumulation regime one, out there for us to evolve right towards, in as much as we're an appendage of our system, right? Examples of this, top-down management of emergent order, forms of returns to Keynesian-style governance, I think, maybe Lenin-esque imperialist management. Here the accumulation regime would be a restoration of something like capital status quo functioning. I'll provide an example below. But given the severity of crisis today, this seems completely thermo-entropically unfeasible for reasons already outlining just how sapped the periphery already is, from which capital draws its inputs to reproduce stuff, how sapped the periphery already is. Can we really restore the old order? Is that ecologically feasible? Two, experimentation with bad forms of chaos. So not the restoration of top-down management, but experimentation with bad forms of chaos. You might think of neocon tactics here, like the development of US DARPA, this agency for robotics, the development of robotics. Research in robots designed to forage for biomass to secure their functioning. So for instance, robots designed to devour human and other materials in war zones. So they would eat humans to go on undergoing programs to, say, kill people, right? And then once the killing's been done, they'll eat up the human and other biomass. That's an experimentation with a bad form of chaos. It doesn't have to do with restoring the old order, right? And that's chaos in the bad sense. But that's an accumulation regime that would respond directly to having extremely low exergy environments, one without a lot of good information to sap up. And Beale's preferred, finally three, Beale's preferred low input oriented, horizontalist-minded capture of spontaneous order. And he likes the example of low input agricultural movements. I'm very close to being done. Just say so. I'll give examples of each. With top-down management of emergent order, option one, the idea is always some variation of reconstituting the status quo current order, keeping capital's structurally necessary features as always. A recent Huffington Post article, and I actually am embarrassed about quoting from this, but you don't see the point, entitled, "Economists Say We Should Tax the Rich at 90%, claims that the key to a sustainable future lies in a top marginal tax rate in the range of 90%, which would decrease both income and wealth inequality, bring in more money for the government, and increase everybody's well-being, even those subject to the new much higher income tax rate. Yet this plan to increase everybody's well-being ought to appear as a thermo-entropic nightmare from the point of view of the constraints on the system's current accumulation regimes, with its already spiraling out of control militarization, its creation of terrorism, and the security apparatus necessary to manage it. But just imagine the demand on input capture that adherence to the directives of this first accumulation regime would imply. Imagine a world of 8 billion people, all with substantive equality on today's materialist terms. What an ecological nightmare. Totally unsustainable on this planet. barring some kind of technological. But again, technology is captured by capital in many senses. So are we investing in the kinds of technologies that might even be robustly efficient enough to kind of raise the standard of wealth for 8 billion people? We don't see that trend developing. Beale provides a chilling example for accumulation regime 2, mentioned above, the exploitation of bad forms of chaos, a last gasp hope to push the system towards an accumulation regime capable of being managed in a decidedly non-democratic form. And again, it's the example of military robotics. The human contingent form can be eliminated. Energetically autonomous tactical robot, Eater is its name. It was a project strongly promoted since 2003 by the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It forages for biomass to produce its own energy source, right? I'll skip that one. Well, yeah, you get the point, right? I wish I could give another example of bad forms of chaos, but I want to move on to the final option. So were this option 2, though, bad forms of chaos, experiment with those, were to take over the system as a whole and become its main mode of accumulation regime or main mode of organization, this would spell doom for capitalism. So the latter will, in its more sane and un-Bush-like moments, resist this outcome. But what alternative can it offer? The obvious answer would be a stable new accumulation regime. But can capitalism really create one anymore? Again, the capital system now inherits a problem of blocked development, at least on the parameters of the current form of its social metabolic reproduction, which could in earlier times be exported to the periphery, but now with the core consuming the periphery and the periphery consuming itself. Well, recall Roy's cannibalistic vision. Right? We see an interesting push for what looks like Beale's favorite accumulation regime, the third that I mentioned, in foreign policy. Again, not the best source to probably take from, but regardless. An October 31st article from this year entitled Germany's Revolution in Small Batch Artisanal Energy. The article basically describes the industrial engine of Europe is increasingly powered by backyard windmills and locally owned solar panels, and this complex patchwork system just might be the future of sustainable energy. Germany's whole power supply, and the way it's managed, looks very different than it did not so long ago. In contrast to the big centralized power plants that can meet demand with roughly the same, basically this is option 1, right? Regular supply day in and day out, the new German system is increasingly a dynamic, decentralized patchwork that includes more than 2 million small and medium-scale renewable producers, businesses, villages and towns, co-ops, individuals, green investment funds, and farmers, whose numbers grow by the month. Their output, and increasingly that of the conventional too, is distributed through a tightly knit cross-border smart grid. The composition of supply changes from minute to minute, depending on the weather, demand, and other factors from one corner of the country to the other. Increasing electricity is generated in and traded from locality to locality, and even across the country, or countries, via intelligent networks much like that in the Schwabisch, which I shouldn't try to even pronounce, but Hall and other places in Germany. The point is that this kind of accumulation regime and its decentered, networked out layout would potentially avoid the ills of capital's structural inequalities enforced by top-down managerial forms of entropy dissipation. This is because such regimes, capital's current and option 2 regimes, are high input regimes. An example, real quick. We all know that in order to buy a loaf of bread today, the easy option is the grocery store with the plastic and wrapped slices, right? What is not always obvious is that obtaining bread in this way reproduces the current accumulation regime with its reliance on an entire system of capitalist production involving the use of plastics to package the bread, big trucks and tires to deliver over hundreds of miles generally. And so the whole system of big oil production, et cetera, again, just to do something very simple, like have bread. Beale refers to capitalism today, therefore, as a high input system. You need so many inputs going into the system just to buy a loaf of bread, right, or to have a loaf of bread. So a high input system requiring top-down managerial control and regulation of even the simplest life activities. So Beale proposes a transition to low input accumulation regimes for food production in what he calls urban agriculture. According to Beale, surprisingly, small farms and gardens turn out to be more efficient than plantation agriculture, which he means by that he means factory farming and so forth. Further, this is the real significance of urban agriculture, with sufficiently high productivity to make a serious contribution to feeding people. Then you can afford to withdraw part of rural agriculture from the current unsustainable system and still retain the total net food production, while this part is being converted to organic, low input, especially if you can sustain yourself on it. He also cites aquaponic greenhouse system technologies, again, because these are low input in their orientation, and thus hold the promise for localized democratic control free of the high input, top-down managerial system. Where the system of capital requires the high input regimes just to reproduce itself, low input regimes require a different set of structural supports premised on the logic of a different political economy, supports such as community-based food production divorced from all the trappings of agribusiness. The virtue of Beale's proposal lies in the fact that low input agriculture could provide a systemic alternative to capital's current high input reproduction of its structurally embedded regimes of accumulation. Now, what is for some a virtue is for others a number of things, not a virtue. Beale's favorite accumulation regime is embraced by a variety of strains of contemporary continental political theory, varieties of beautiful soul-oriented Deleuzo-Guattarianism, not Deleuze and Guattari themselves, but beautiful soul-oriented versions of this, right? Tactic-oriented anarchism, Occupy-oriented democratic theory, championing grassroots organizational principles, etc. Those are all pretty much low-input modeled or localized networked-out models, right? But these have also been heavily criticized by the recent accelerationist movement, for example. I don't know if any of you are keeping up with that literature. For instance, coming from Nick Land and Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams' work. For these latter, the accelerationist group, horizontalisms like Beale's, we can presume, fail to grasp the ineluctability of the capital system's cybernetic intensification, an idea that originates with Nick Land. Basically just it's speeding up. Like it's impossible to stop it, especially if we're not the agent in control anymore, right? Or fails to grasp the inescapability of its tendencies toward technological singularity, an idea that originates with Land too, but is also developed by Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams. Srnicek and Williams are decidedly opposed to visions such as Beale's low-input, local, democratic, and horizontalist picture. Why? Well, such pictures are deemed unrealistic. They are deemed retrograde to the way in which we ought to harness capitalist technologies, theoretical tools, and empirical data. Here, I'm basically quoting from their accelerationist manifesto. Interestingly, they also pick up on Lenin's notion expressed in left-wing childishness, that socialism or some post-capitalist order, which promises a form of substantive equality, is, for Lenin, right, is inconceivable without planned state organization based on the latest discoveries of modern science. It is inconceivable without planned state organization, which keeps tens of millions of people to the strict observance of a unified standard in production and distribution. We Marxists, Lenin continues, have always spoken of this, and it is not worthwhile wasting 2 seconds talking to people who do not understand this, i.e., still him, anarchists and a good half of the left socialist revolutionaries. So, in a way, I think that Lenin is, I don't know if he's a proto-accelerationist, but he certainly seems to want to maintain option 1, to build up the order of our social metabolic reproduction before we can transcend it, to restore the old order in a sense. As part of the project of coming it, necessarily, you still have to do that. Now, Srnicek and Williams do not, in fact, identify capitalism with the agent of acceleration and argue that if the political left is to have a future, it must be one which maximally embraces this suppressed accelerationist tendency. I'm really close to being done now. So while these authors do not champion capitalism per se, they do champion certain aspects of its mode of production or accumulation regime. The question I pose to accelerationists is simply whether such visions of acceleration are not versions of the first accumulation regime, top-down control of emergent order, and so, following Beale, thermo-entropically unrealizable potentials, continuations of ecologically inadequate high-input accumulation strategies. But perhaps only a machine can save us. I feel like this is something they would have said. Srnicek and Williams have opened up an important debate in continental philosophy and Marxist and other forms of political theorizing. I feel that, taking a nod from Beale, examining the entropy of capitalism has got to be an important part of this conversation. Indeed, to borrow an image from Nick Land, philosophy has an affinity with despotism due to its predilection for platonic top-down solutions that always screw up viciously. But, and I don't know that I agree with that necessarily, but it's a striking claim. But is there something peculiar to philosophy which assimilates a kind of entropically unsustainable energy. Similarly, we might examine Henry Giroux, I don't know if any of you followed him, but his constant calls for democracy based on new forms of pedagogy along similar lines. What form of democracy is actually entropically sound in terms of ecologically minded analyses of the social, metabolic, reproductive order? Again, I think anything like a democracy within our current kind of liberal, neoliberal capitalism would be a sustainable mess. But certainly it is possible that some future orientations or readings of Marx, and many others, are at stake in these debates, to say nothing of the world in which such debates might find a place. That's all. Thanks. Yeah.
I have a clarifying question. Could you just say a little bit more about what you mean by information and what wouldn't be information?
Well, so for me, information in this context is the kinds of inputs one can use to build structure. So it has a tendency in which it could be used for, the building of bad structure, right? But it's mainly meant to, to refer to the kind of internal coherency or consistency that does equate with good structure. And so not everything is information, though. I mean, it depends on the system. Some systems will process what other systems will process as information, as noise. And so then some questions might be, well, how does one convert noise into information and so forth? So not everything is information, actually. It's actually this kind of high-grade, lowly entropic, kind of rich signs of variety, as Beale put it at one point, stuff that is used to generate and maintain structure, right? Like, here's a simple example. I mean, humans and say, eating an orange, we have to have some information that it's not going to kill us, or eating a fruit, we can't eat certain fruits, we have to have that kind of information. So it's generally used, if you want, for what are hopefully desired ends towards building structure, but yeah. So, information is fully part of any kind of materialist framework, thinking how systems might process and reproduce their structure. In general, not everybody takes the information route, but since I think the work in the 60s and 70s by certain systems theorists, information is becoming a key term. 50s, really, I would say. Yes?
Yeah, I really liked your talk this long time. I almost don't know what to say, except that was really great.
Thanks.
But I have a question about how utopian you can take this idea, right? The option 3, the low input force manufacturing. So with 8 billion people and the collapses that are happening, like this sort of system theory way of looking at it, is there any optimism that we're not going to have a massive human die-off or a slum world that's going to keep growing based on, I agree, whatever Germany's doing is great, what we're doing even in Latvia is great, farmers markets and horizontal and stuff. But where is the optimism, or what's a sustainable population?
I'd first rather pick on you a little bit and say that when you ask how utopian it might be, I would reject that actually as a possibility. That there can never be any kind of utopian program of any sort. Just the very conditions of the systems thermodynamically or life itself would never entail any kind of utopianism, except of the most idealist in the bad sense kind of variety. But as for the rest of what you're saying, I don't know. This is something we were just talking about over here. I don't think the prospects for that route of development to develop that accumulation regime, as I called it, are great. I think one of the things that troubles it is we don't really know where agency and power to do things comes from. Like, how do you turn people into the sorts of people who would even want to engage in low input types of lifestyles and so forth, right? It's hard to produce those kinds of people. They're sort of, not very numerous. And so I like the idea of it. It jives well with, this desire I have. If I define myself as a radical, it just basically means that I'm interested in trying to preserve the basic conditions of, living a human life. I think that's what radicalism amounts to today. It's just if you ensure that, because it's that hard to, and in the politics that would go along with ensuring the minimal conditions of some kind of future human life, even if that becomes somewhat cyborg-esque or whatever, but some kind of minimally sort of recognizable humanism. The conditions for doing that just seem to be dwindling. The conditions for the possibility of creating that kind of human seem to be dwindling to such an extent that now, I feel like radicalism can only be truly fulfilled if it's like, can we just basically continue on, period, so to ensure the minimal conditions of survival. It seems like, the game is up, though, in many ways, for those who would wish to return to some kind of humanist-based democratic form of, local localization, local horizontal living. even though I hate to say that. So I'm not very optimistic, personally, about accumulation regime. Number 3, taking hold, especially not before, like you mentioned, some kind of large-scale societal collapse, which might entail something like the destruction of large swaths of the human population. But then maybe, if something like that did happen, this is pure and utter speculation coming from me, especially because I don't try to study, problems of social collapse. I mean, I've looked into the literature a bit, but, I think that requires a very specialist knowledge I just don't have. But maybe if there was some kind of, sort of systemic collapse, maybe then one would maybe even be necessitated to return to that kind of root-free, kind of low-input lifestyle, right? We all have this fantasy vision of a return to kind of basic forms of simple agriculture or hunter-gatherism when the whole, shithouse goes up in flames, as it were. Maybe that's the moment in which that accumulation regime could be realized, if there's, a kind of livable planet to survive on at that point. And I think that is a big if, and I don't want to sound pessimistic or cynical. And again, this isn't coming from like good, kind of empirical research, but I think that the crises that confront us today are so potentially catastrophic that we'd have to be a little hopeful to hope for the survival of our species into the next century. That's how pessimistic I leave it. And that's probably too pessimistic, but I just don't know. I mean, you think about things like methane gas being released into our environment, and can we really breathe under the conditions? And can we develop the technologies to allow people to breathe it? We have to become some kind of cyborg creature just to fend off the entropy that we've produced and low quality waste and chaos. Fukushima, every ecological system we have is ailing, okay, etc.
So I have a question you I think starting to answer about the accelerationist movement and what that is. Is it sort of the idea that rather than fight capitalism, you allow its process to accelerate? So what you're saying, it's going to lead to its own conditions to produce. Some sort of like Nietzsche saying you fight nihilism not by letting it run its course. Nihilism overcomes itself, and that's what leads to transformation. And then just as a specific case of this, at one point you're talking about neoliberalism, path-dependency, and saying that you thought that was in the process of coming to an end. Is that a specific case of what you're talking about, accelerationism, like something's happening with the neoliberal stage currently because of its acceleration of capital that's leading to what? Something else that you're foreseeing?
Yeah, no, I mean,
two questions but related.
It could be a case of, certainly if you just read some of the accelerationist literature, they are talking about this accumulation regime that I referred to as, of course, not only I, but calling it an accumulation regime is certainly a kind of particular alien move that I'm making. But yeah, it's through and through defined as a kind of taking advantage of to escape the neoliberal paradigm, but certainly not to sort of avoid it wholesale or to try to pretend that it doesn't exist. So acceleration may be a sort of case of neoliberalism, or neoliberalism. Neoliberalism could be a kind of case of accelerationism. We'd have to do some interesting intellectual history there to kind of figure that out. But they do have that kind of deep correspondence. Your definition of acceleration is pretty much right on the money too. So, I mean, yeah, it's the idea of harnessing, the technologies that neoliberalism, for example, can, or has brought about, but then to hopefully see that they will unfurl the more heinous aspects of the system. And now you have to repeat anything you're still interested in hearing, because I've lost become untethered what you said from my.
Well, say I want to be an activist in the accelerationist movement, like what are the tendencies in capitalism that I should be accelerating?
Yeah. The big emphases seem to be on sort of, technologies, but I don't know how it plays out for them. I just don't know the literature well enough. I couldn't tell you. I'm going to have to be honest.
Like information technology?
Information technologies, yeah, I'm thinking of like, that kind of use of the internet, right? Those kinds of easy answers, but I don't know how it really works in the details yet. Which is why you might have noticed that the last page of my relatively long talk is devoted to that kind of speculation. It's just now at the kind of forefront of some of the stuff I'm looking at. So I'm still learning, and I don't entirely know. Maybe I can look at the video now and just think, hey, the accelerationists out there watching this. But can you come in and sort of give us a hand here? Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the transition period that you see happening before or leading up to these new accumulation regimes.
Mm-hmm.
you foresee some sort of pushback or a rise of militarism for the sake of trying to prevent these certain accumulation regimes from running their course? And if so, what sort of answer?
Occupy Wall Street was a good example of a pushback against the kinds of, more crass tendencies. Then again, I mean, if you're an accelerationist, you thought that was just a kind of, sad example of, good counter resistance or something, or resistance, I should say.
But back from the other direction.
Yeah, no, I do. I think that, the Pentagon now is sort of trying to make policy and plan and come up with solutions to controlling the population internally. The NSA stuff, all that is a push against developing a more democratic accumulation regime.
And I'm wondering, sorry, follow-up question. I'm wondering if you think that either one of these potential options of accumulation regimes, the three different options, what their answer might be to, not answer, that's the wrong word, but for lack of a better word, what their answer might be to try to prevent these pushbacks, and which one of these options might have a stronger defensive mechanism.
So option 2 is almost like, let's just do the pushback. Bad forms of chaos and experimentation with them. But I think one has a kind of naive sense of how it might be done, given our ecology, to try to restore the old order. And by the way, the old order right now is pretty much what we're in right now at this point. From the point of view of the future behavior of the system, just like, can we do this for any longer, so trying to rebuild this eviscerated middle class, a program that option 1 might attempt, but it seems ecologically unfeasible. Again, the example of, can you really raise the wealth and well-being of roughly 6 billion people, to be anywhere near like a kind of a democratic kind of social configuration or something like that. So option 1 and option 3, I think especially option 3 are actually realistically engaged in forms of activism that would be ecologically sound. But I think that with option 3, low input kind of agriculture, things like that, they're just, they don't have the force of material persuasion or something like that at this point, And again, for me, this is a big question of, how do you create the kinds of people who would actually want to, try to practice low input agriculture? It's a tough thing to do, grow your own food and so forth. It's not easy for a lot of reasons, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the difficulty of growing your own food. That actually might be easy, but to decouple from the rest of the kinds of systems that go along with food production, et cetera, travel, where we get our clothing from and our shelter from, it just seems like a tough business or enterprise. And so, again, how do you you can think about producing those kinds of populations, and to even say, how do you think about producing these populations is a bit of a kind of imperialist kind of response to a question like, produce the population, right? Which is why, brings up, questions of fear of, things like, genocide or something like this, and who decides on those things. So, I think that largely the world we're in now has some determinate tendencies which seem realistic, but we're really, very much in a systemic crisis, which is hard to predict in advance if possible at all. In fact, systems theoretical jargon that came out of people like Emmanuel Wallerstein, whose idea it is that if you have a system that's in a state of chaos, then and it's in a state of bifurcation, it's actually impossible. Literally, we don't have the analytic tools to predict which way the system will go, which could give some people hope. So in situations of absolute chaos, there might be more space for pushes towards forms of democracy, whether or not those be kind of local, horizontal oriented, or whether or not they might be of the kind of more Lenin-esque kind of accelerationist, say. Let's assemble it using the force of good state management or something like that. So it's just a tough field. All business of trying to predict anything is tough anyway. But thanks for the question. It's a good question. I'm just thinking about these things too. And I don't know if you wanted to ask that question, but you had your hand up for a second.
Oh yeah, it seems to me like the accelerationist stuff though is like a product of the. That's just like, all the other stuff is too hard. Let's just take the do nothing approach and let it. It seems like a theoretical justification just to let things play out. Is that a fair, or is that just
I don't know if it's fair, because they will admit that. And they'll tend to use different, sort of less passive language, like let it play out, as opposed to like let's accelerate it. But I can see how, of course, there's this kind of internal coherence between those two things, that kind of over-aggressive, kind of passive, let's just let the system not let, but let's have the system kind of unfold according to its own kind of internal logic, and then at the same time, it's almost the same thing as just, well, maybe the best way to do that is then just to be the most passive couch potato or something like that, right? But they don't, I mean, they don't actually paint it in quite the same rhetoric.
Sure.
They do admit that they have, that movement is precisely a product of its kind of, political and social conditions. So they don't, try to divorce it from them. So they would admit, frankly, again, that acceleration is the very part of these processes of capital. It's kind of more heinous aspects of capitalism. They just want to separate out those heinous aspects from some kind of potential use of what's not heinous in the system. And again, I don't know how that plays out in particular for them. Just kind of reading that stuff now.
Yeah, I would be interested to see how they would respond. Well, if the system's cannibalizing and self-destructing and parasitical, like, aren't you just accelerating really your own cannibalist, your own like self-consumption? I guess though that would be part of, well, we got to separate out what is causing that with what's not. I mean.
Yeah, and I shouldn't paint accelerationism as kind of more monolithic.
Sure.
Right. I mean, Nick Land was actually into precisely the ideas that and maybe he still is. I mean, I read his early works really at this point, but it's into the idea that we do try to transcend the kind of human form, and and it's unavoidable, and it's sort of like this crass, retrograde, naive kind of thinking that we could say have anything like a human kind of program anymore. So he says, take advantage of becoming like the Terminator with its capacity to morph into any kind of creature and to bring about the future, right? For Nick Land, like the future, the destruction of the future is already embedded in our system, and to try to avoid it is absurd. That we should hasten its end and maybe get a being that's a little bit more worthy of, in a kind of Nietzschean sense, a little bit more worthy of its event or something. I don't know. And that might be painting it a little too dramatically too, but I mean, I think you do get those tendencies in those writings. If anybody knows this stuff better than I do, please feel free to chime in and correct me on this. But it's a recent hobby of about 6 months I've been trying to get into this acceleration stuff. So.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe, if anyone has something they'd like, or we can just continue over.
Yeah, and I'm fine with it, of course. Thanks everybody for giving me your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you.